Hello, Anatomy and Physiology Honors. We've got your lecture here for Friday, May 1st. Can you believe it's May? It's our last month of school and online school and time to wrap up some stuff. So let's get after it. We're going to talk about the structures of the kidney today and then blood flow through the kidney. And you're going to want maybe some colored pencils for class today. All right, so we are looking at the inside of a kidney here. So here's our kidney, and if we were to cut it in half and kind of open it up, this one on the left is a real kidney, and then we've got our cartoon picture over here. The hilum, the renal hilum right here, this little section where it's sort of pinched in a little bit, the bean shape of the kidney, is this area right here where you've got a lot of tubes and blood vessels coming in and out of it. All right, so let's go through these structures. So the outer portion of our kidney is called the cortex, the renal cortex, and this is just the outside. So just like the outside of the brain was the cortex and the inside was the medulla, and the adrenal glands had an outside cortex and an inside medulla, same with the kidney. So just the outside portion is called the renal cortex. And the renal medulla is basically this whole section in here, not including the tubes, but all the rest of this region would be the medulla, the inner layer of the kidney. 3 on here is called the major calyx. All of these pieces here that are kind of beige, this is sort of a collecting space for when the urine is produced through the nephrons. It sort of funnels in here, gathers, and then it gathers in this region and then heads down this tube. So the major calyx is just a collecting region of the kidney. We have the renal papillar. It's sort of our very base of what's called the renal pyramid, which we'll get to in a second, just the bottom piece of it. The renal pelvis is this larger area where the urine is going to be collected. And so it's sort of the major region where urine's collected. And then we've got the minor calyx. So if this was the major calyx, these are the minor calyx, these small other areas. So urine would be here in the minor, then the major, and then the renal pelvis. All right, once urine is collected in these areas, it's going to travel down the ureter. And from there, it heads to the bladder. It'll transfer down through peristalsis. And these little sections in here, they kind of look like, I don't know, grapefruit sections. They have sort of a triangle-like shape. They're called the renal pyramids. And this is sort of a region where a lot of the filtering is happening, where our nephrons are located. The renal columns are these areas in between the renal pyramids, and there's blood vessels that you would find in there. And then the renal capsule is what we call the external portion of our kidney, so the outer parts of the kidney. I don't know if you guys can hear, but Penny is snoring very loud. All right, so that's just the anatomy of the kidney. Pretty basic stuff. A few new terms for you, some that maybe are a little familiar. All right, so, and I failed to mention that picture, obviously, that we were just doing there was on page 2. I want you guys to jump real quick to page 9. This is like a teeny tiny, like 3 chart there on page 9, kind of off to the side. So our kidney is mainly broken up into just these 3 regions, the renal cortex, the renal medulla, and the renal pelvis. So the outside, the middle, and then the area where the urine is collected. So just the 3 basic regions to be aware of. The main structure, the basic unit of our kidney is called the nephron. And we find those, they basically are in the cortex and the medulla. So with this picture here, you can see the kidney, and then notice the little triangles, the pyramids, those renal pyramids. This little triangle is showing you a section of the kidney. This portion right here that's lighter in color would be the cortex, and this portion down here is the medulla. So this guy, this whole yellow kind of twisty tube is called the nephron, and the majority of the nephron tubules are going to be clustered above in the cortex region, And then you've got this one loop that drops down. It's long and skinny. So, and that makes up mostly the renal medulla. So because the nephron, the big chunky twisty part up top, that is the majority of the nephron. About 85% of our nephron structure is found in the cortex. And then that loop dips down into the renal medulla. And so about 15% of the loops end up being dropped down into the medulla. So the cortex actually has the majority of our nephron structure in it. That's going to be on your homework assignment. Alrighty. So we have here, this would be on the page with the kidney that we already labeled. The picture I have here is just for reference. It is not the same as the one that we just labeled there on page 2. But you can see these arteries as I go through. I would encourage you to use a red, blue, and purple writing utensil or highlighter. Even you can write it in pencil and then maybe underline or block these things off so that you can easily identify these structures that are arteries, veins, and capillaries as we go through them. So when we're talking about blood flow, all blood starts off leaving your heart and going to the aorta. So from the aorta, it breaks down into its arteries. The major artery that branches off of the aorta into the kidney is the renal artery right here. So that's the first artery in this blood flow through our kidney. And then the renal artery starts branching off. So here's a branch there, and a branch there. Those are called the segmental arteries because they're breaking off into smaller segments, segmented arteries. And then the third step is called the interlobular artery. So when the segmented artery breaks off and goes between each of the renal pyramids, so right here and right here and right here, they're in between the lobes, and so it's called the interlobar arteries. And then they sort of arc around the top of those renal pyramids. And so you can see here, you can see it here. And so the way I remember this one, it's called the arcuate artery, and it almost looks like it's arcing, right? It's the like arch part on top of those renal pyramids. And then from there, they break off into smaller, teeny tiny arteries up here in the cortex. And because they're in the cortex, they're called the cortical radiate arteries. They're sort of radiating out into the cortex, teenier and tinier. So it goes from smaller to smaller to smaller to smaller. And then everything that's in this box here, the dotted line, all of these are pretty much microscopic. We're going to show you on another picture all of these, but they would be in these regions, but we can't even see them because they're so teeny tiny on this picture. So the sixth step is it turns into the afferent artery. From there, the blood vessels head into the structure called the glomerulus, where pressure is really high, super important for filtration. Then we have our efferent arterioles. So arteries go to smaller arteries, right? Arteriole, so we're getting into our teeny tiny, smaller and smaller arteries. And then 9, all of this has been read so far, all of these are arteries. 9 is the actual capillary, and they're called the peritubular capillaries. And there's tons of them, and they span all over the nephron. We'll see that here in a minute. So capillaries is where the gas exchange is happening with oxygen and carbon dioxide. And this is where the exchange of a lot of nutrients in and out of the nephron is going to be. After it's done its job with the nephron, the blood heading back towards the heart, it's going to first head into, and these are all the opposite, we're just missing one. So basically it's this in reverse, minus 1. So 10 here is going to be that cortical radiate vein, so this teeny guy coming off here in the cortex. Then we have our arcuate vein because it's the arch, it's up top above our pyramid. And then it comes down in between the pyramids into the interlobar vein, and then straight on to our renal vein. The only thing that is different from this list over here is that there's no segmental vein. It just goes straight from interlobar to the renal vein. So that's the basic blood flow through the kidney on the large and small scale. And for our last thing today, we're going to look at the microscopic blood flow through our nephron. So we're super zooming in here on the nephron and this very unique structure. This kind of looks like a hot mess that we're going to learn here, but there is key important things, and it is really important you learn the structure of this to understand how the kidney works and functions. To make this easier, this page is in black and white, even on if you colored in picture or printed a colored version of your packet, because I want you to color it. So I colored mine and I took a picture of it and added it here to the slideshow. And so you can see the arteries and the veins a little easier if you do color them here. So what I've got going on is some red. Please note kind of where this transition is and how what is considered the artery on the inside here and what's yellow. The blue is representing my veins. I have purple for those capillaries. And then the yellow is representing everything that's a part of the nephron and the collecting ducts that make up the nephron. So now's a good time to pause the video and go ahead and color this. And I'm about to go over all of these structures and identify them in order with you. Okay, so let's go through this. I'm not going through the numbers. I'm actually going to go in order of how blood would flow through. It is not the numbers that are on here. Those are just identifying numbers. So first thing isn't even labeled on here. I want you to draw a red arrow going into our red blood vessels. So this would be coming from our renal artery and from all those other divisions, the interlobar artery, arcuate artery, etc. Okay, so this would be the blood flow coming in. So we want to label this guy, and I'm going to use it in red. This would be representing the interlobar artery in between the two pyramids. And then 6 here is the arching one above, so it's the arcuate artery. From that, it branches off into a smaller artery up top. That's the cortical radiate artery. So we already saw these guys on the kidney. And then from there, this reaches down and it gets into this teeny tiny artery heading into this interesting structure called the afferent arteriole. Afferent should sound familiar. We talked about our afferent and efferent pathways in our nervous system. Afferent, okay, was always when it was going in to our nervous system and our spinal cord. Efferent was going out to the effectors. And so afferent, there is a teeny tiny arrow here. If you were like me and kind of colored on top of it, you might draw an arrow with your afferent artery heading into this structure right here, because afferent is going towards. So this structure right here, think of it like a catcher's mitt. So if these are the arteries, they're going, this catcher's mitt is kind of surrounding all these arteries here. And we call this structure the Bowman's capsule, and it's a part of the nephron. And it's just named after the guy that discovered it, Bowman's capsule. All of these blood vessels inside of here are called the Glom Glomerulus. And this is basically this tightly networked little folds of teeny tiny capillaries in here, but they're still oxygenated. So it's still considered part of the arterial system. So it's red in here. And the part leaving here isn't afferent, it's going to be efferent. And so we're going to draw a little arrow coming out, right, of our Bowman's capsule and the glomulus and label this the efferent arteriole. It's this one coming out. So once blood is entered into the Bowman's capsule, there's a lot of high pressure stuff going on here. We've got some the beginning stages of filtration. Then the arteriole breaks off into small capillaries. And so all of this other stuff down here, this twisty stuff is the capillaries that are going to be, we're going to go through all of this in detail about how this is filtering your blood. It has a really important role. And notice how it's all twisted around the nephron. So these guys, these capillaries are called the peritubular capillaries. We labeled that on our other page there. And they are wrapping all around our nephron. The part of the nephron, so notice this big long loop right here. If you were to trace this nephron right here, you would eventually trace it to the beginning of the loop. Any part of the nephron that comes before the loop, because it's closer to the Bowman's capsule, it's called the proximal collecting tube. Proximal because it's more close, okay, closer to the Bowman's capsule, this point of attachment, just like our proximal part of my arm, right, was near my shoulder, whereas my fingers would be the distal part of my arm because it's further away. So this part that's closer to the tube is the proximal, PCT for short, proximal collecting tube. Once that collecting duct materials, and in this tube, the reason it's yellow is this is where urine is starting to be formed through a bunch of processes we'll get through. It travels down and circles around. This is called the loop of Henle, named after the gentleman that discovered it, loop of Henle. From there, the tube wraps around more, and because this is further from our Bowman's capsule, this is called the distal collecting tube, or DCT, distal collecting tube. And then from there, the urine that's being produced basically just gets funneled down this tube called the collecting duct. The collecting duct empties into our renal pelvis, and then from there, it's eventually going to empty into the ureter. And so we basically formed urine through this tube and the processes along with the peritubular capillaries. But we're not done yet, okay? So the blood that's been traveling through here, getting filtered, bad stuff is heading out this way. The good stuff, we still have stuff in here we want to keep, is going to head back this way to this vein right here. So this is going to be that cortical radiant vein, and then it's going to head to, much like this was the arcuate artery, this is the arcuate vein, the one that goes above my renal pelvis, and then it's going to go in between, not pelvis, excuse me, the renal pyramids, and then it's going to go between those pyramids in the through the interlobar vein. And from there, the interlobar vein, it's going to eventually flow out of the kidney through the renal vein and eventually the vena cava and back to the heart again. So we have a flowchart version, and now we have a picture version showing you the flow of blood through the kidney. And that's all for today. Make sure and do your homework assignment and enjoy your Friday, enjoy your weekend, stay safe. Hope you're well. Bye.